referenced this article in my earlier video on Prince Harry's court case against the Mirror. But let me just tell you, this article makes me feel like I want to be where the journalists are. I want to see them ethically reporting. This comes from Prospect Magazine. It's from Tom Lamont, posted May 9th, 2023. Prince Harry versus the press. I'm going to give an overview of the parts that I highlighted from the article. Our gateway into this article is Graham Johnson. Graham is a former tabloid journalist who once engaged in unlawful information gathering turned vigilante. He is part of a group of, quote, improbable agents of reform, including chastened investigators, aggrieved celebs, one senior royal out for revenge, and Graham Johnson, end quote. Nick Davies was the journalist for The Guardian that broke the story on the phone hacking scandals back in the early 2010s. And Nick Davies is quoted as saying, quote, Graham is unique, the only one who stepped forward of his own initiative and accepted prosecution, end quote. Graham had secured an agreement where he could give information to the police off the record as an intelligence source. But during the meeting, he voluntarily overturned the agreement and said he would go public on the record about his involvement in hacking. He's among a group of several former tabloid journalists who are trying to make amends for the damage they caused. Another one of those former tabloid investigators that is interviewed for this piece is Dan Evans. His work was so successful that he was soon, quote, buying drugs from train guards, hiring hitmen, nicking pedos. People on the outside look at this sort of work and think you're ghoulish. You are ghoulish, end quote. He then recounts to the author how in 2003, a Mirror Group executive took him aside and showed him how to dial in and listen without permission to someone's voicemails. Soon, Dan Evans had his own Palm Pilot and was hacking people day and night. Dan claims he was encouraged to use cheap mobile phones and to throw them in the river after work. And what's particularly cruel about this is not just the invasion of privacy, but the way it made people distrust those around them. Because a lot of times these stories would be attributed to a close personal friend or source. This ruined relationships for individuals who were hacked. Evans then talks about how he moved to News of the World when it was under Andy Coulson. Remember, just as a quick refresh, Rebekah Brooks was the editor of News of the World and then The Sun. Andy Coulson was her deputy editor at News of the World, taking over as editor when Rebekah Brooks left. They also had a long-term affair. Andy Coulson would eventually take the fall and go to jail for a couple of months over intent to phone hack. Dan describes Coulson as just as ruthless as his predecessor, Brooks, and that they were told to just, quote, hack the effing phones, end quote. Moving on to the 2006 police raids. This is when Clive Goodman, who was the newspaper's royal editor for News of the World, was arrested on suspicion of phone hacking and voicemail interception, along with private investigator Glenn Mulcair. Evans said that next day at News Corp, they were told no more hacking. Dan says that he personally destroyed evidence, including burning documents in his parents' backyard. The article then goes into how media conglomerates like the Mirror Group have used money to keep all of this information out of the public eye. It's estimated that, for example, total hacking-related costs related to Murdoch's publishing empire stood at over $1 billion in 2022. This is a lot of money, but the potential press and blowback from having to go to trial could be disastrous for these companies. And for anyone that thinks this is just Prince Harry, it's not. Reporting is just very subdued on this topic. In this article, Tom states that at the time of writing this piece, there are currently 162 cases involving News Corp and 113 involving the Mirror Group. This is the part I found super interesting because I am not a UK legal expert. I'm not an American legal expert, let's be honest. But he talks about this idea of, quote, there is such a thing as an offer a claimant cannot afford to reject, end quote. He goes on to discuss the process of bringing a claim against a tabloid and how they will put in all this work, put together great bundles of evidence, skeleton arguments, maybe even hammer down dates for the eventual trial, and then hours, even days beforehand, it'll all be called off. Quote, the claimant or claimants will have agreed to settle for, say, a six-figure sum, because if they were to risk going to trial, they might lose. Somehow worse, they might win, only to be awarded less in damages than they'd been offered to settle out of court. In either case, they would be liable for costs, because costs tend to dwarf damages. You don't want to lose your house in order to give millions of pounds to someone you hate. End quote. The problem is if you have a 1 in 1,000 kind of claimant, the kind that cannot and will not be bought off, the kind that is not seeking money, and that is Prince Harry. Because again, what is more damaging to these media companies? This information coming out in court. But part of the problem, and why people like Graham Johnson have co-founded Byline Investigates, or Dan Evans has been trying to start up his own website, is that, as Evans says, quote, because every time there's a hearing, loads of amazing evidence comes out, and evidence that the police or public inquiries never managed to get near, and there's little to no reporting on it. And I have to imagine it's because other tabloids realize that if one of them goes down, there might be a domino effect. So it would behoove them to bury some of the more nefarious details. The fact that I did not know, quote, lawyers for the Mirror Group had been trying with a chutzpah I found almost admirable to persuade the judge to preclude Prince Harry from the coming trial. Wouldn't it be better if another one of the potential claimants, for instance, the comedic actor Ricky Tomlinson, were foregrounded instead? And I can understand why they don't want Prince Harry there. Prince Harry attracts media attention. Media cannot stay away from him. He is like delicious catnip wrapped in Dior. Prince Harry means more attention, means more focus, means potentially more interest in the evidence that is presented in the case. And that is not what the Mirror, the Sun, etc. wants. Remember those filings that came out a week or two ago from Prince Harry that included that secret agreement between Prince William and Murdoch? Another thing those papers included were, quote, serious accusations that Piers Morgan knew about, encouraged, and concealed illegal news gathering when he was editor of the News of the World in the 1990s. Representatives for the Mirror Group have elsewhere made clear admissions that articles published under Morgan's editorship of the Daily Mirror were sourced through unlawful means. This, despite the fact that Morgan has always denied involvement in anything criminal, end quote. Remember, Piers Morgan was fired from the Daily Mirror in 2004. It was over alleged hoax photos of Iraqi soldiers being tortured. In some sense, it makes sense to throw Piers under the bus. The Mirror is running a familiar play in which it is trying to convince everyone that the newsroom now is very different from the newsroom culture of the late 90s. Those people are gone. Nothing to see here. Piers did it. Now, Piers Morgan's TV show is currently a part of the Murdoch empire. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. And it probably depends in large part on his ratings. This article also touches on the Levinson inquiries. There was supposed to be a follow-up inquiry that would, quote, look more closely at the troubling interdependence of the press and the police in the UK, end quote. Successive Tory governments, starting with David Cameron, have bailed on that promise. They delayed the second part at first to give a fair trial to Brooks and Coulson. And then after the trial, it was made clear that it just wasn't relevant anymore. Justice is served, okay, bye. And obviously it would behoove the media to stick to this narrative that justice was delivered and everything was concluded back in the early 2010s. I cannot recommend this piece enough. It does a great job of tying in all the players that you've maybe tangentially heard about that were involved in phone hacking and brings them all together. It's like one big Marvel movie. It's a great primer to understanding the cases going on now. Give it a read and let me know what you think.